I'm worthless. A disappointment. That's what my mother told every neighbor on Maple Street when I moved out at 18. She said it again when I didn't come crawling back after my first apartment lease. And she repeated it like a prayer when I stopped answering her calls demanding I pay for my brother's gambling debts. But I was there, invisible in my car across the street, watching when the police finally arrested him for check fraud. My name is Rebecca, and from wherever you're watching this, you need to hear what happened next. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever had someone try to steal your life's work, only to discover you become too powerful for them to even touch? The Locksmith truck pulled up to my driveway at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was inside my home office, the one I'd built from scratch after years of sleeping on friends' couches and eating ramen for dinner. Through my window, I watched my mother step out of her rusted Honda, pointing dramatically at my front door like she owned the place. "Break down the door, this is my son's house now," she screamed at the confused locksmith, waving some crumpled papers in the air. "My daughter abandoned the family, so everything goes to Marcus now. He needs this more than she does." The locksmith, a middle-aged man with calloused hands, looked between her and my clearly marked address. "Ma'am, I'm going to need proper documentation. This doesn't look. I have documentation." She thrust the papers at him. "Power of attorney. Family rights. That ungrateful girl hasn't spoken to us in 3 years. She owes us this much." I sat in my ergonomic chair, the first piece of real furniture I'd ever owned, and watched this woman who'd called me selfish, cold, and too smart for her own good, try to literally break into the life I'd built without her. The same woman who told everyone at church that I was going through a phase when I started my tech consulting business. Who laughed when I said I was saving for a house. Who told my aunts I'd never amount to anything because I thought I was better than everyone. But here's what she didn't know as she stood on my pristine driveway, yelling at a locksmith who was already backing toward his truck. I wasn't just the daughter who'd escaped. I wasn't just the girl who'd proven her wrong about everything. I was about to make one phone call that would change the entire game. The locksmith was shaking his head now. "Lady, I can't just break down someone's door based on handwritten notes. This address belongs to Rebecca Chin according to public records, and unless you can prove she stole this from the family," my mother shrieked, her voice carrying across the quiet suburban street where my neighbors were probably peeking through their curtains. "Everything she has should belong to Marcus. He's struggling. He has kids. He needs help. Marcus. My younger brother. The golden child who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. The one they'd bailed out of trouble 17 times while telling me I was dramatic for asking for help with college applications. The one they'd given their car to while I walked to my minimum wage job. The one who was now, apparently, so desperate that they thought they could just take my house." I picked up my phone, the latest iPhone, not the cracked hand-me-down I'd carried for years, and scrolled through my contacts. The locksmith was explaining something about legal procedures and court orders, but my mother wasn't listening. She was too busy describing to him how I'd stolen opportunities from Marcus, how I'd been selfish and ungrateful my whole life, how this house should rightfully belong to family who deserved it. Family who deserved it. The irony was almost beautiful. Because while she stood there trying to break down my door, she had no idea that the worthless daughter, who'd embarrassed her at family gatherings, was now the same woman who'd just signed a 7-figure consulting contract with the city's largest development firm. The same girl they'd called too ambitious for her own good, now had the mayor's personal number in her phone. The daughter who thought she was too good for everyone, was about to demonstrate exactly how good she'd become. I touched the screen once. The call connected immediately. "Rebecca? This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" The voice was crisp, professional, immediately attentive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I never raised my voice. I never lost my composure. I simply said, I need a favor. There's a situation at my residence that requires immediate police attention. Attempted break-in with fraudulent documentation. Address? I gave it calmly while watching my mother gesture wildly at the locksmith, who was now actively packing up his tools. Officers are en route. Anything else? Just one thing, I said, still watching through my window as my mother tried one more desperate plea with the retreating locksmith. When they arrive, please make sure they understand this is a family matter that's about to become a legal one. I ended the call and finally stood up from my chair. In exactly 4 minutes, 3 police cars would turn onto Maple Street. In 5 minutes, my mother would learn that her worthless daughter had become someone whose single phone call could mobilize the entire police department. But most importantly, in 6 minutes, she would discover that the daughter she'd tried to erase had become someone she couldn't ignore, couldn't intimidate, and definitely couldn't rob. The girl they'd called a failure was about to show them what real power looked like. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just one quiet phone call that would change everything. Stay with me. Because what happened next will show you exactly what happens when someone tries to take from a woman who's learned to take back. The first police car rounded the corner of Willowbrook Drive at exactly 2:51 p.m. I watched from my living room window as Officer Martinez stepped out, his radio crackling with dispatch codes I'd learned to recognize from my work with the City Planning Commission. Behind him, 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their presence immediately transforming my quiet suburban street into something that demanded attention. My mother was still arguing with the locksmith when she noticed the approaching officers. Her voice, which had been escalating for the past 10 minutes, suddenly caught in her throat. The locksmith, whose name tag read Tony, looked relieved as he quickly loaded his tools back into his truck. "Ma'am, we received a call about an attempted break-in at this address," Officer Martinez said, his tone professional but firm. His eyes scanned the scene, my mother clutching her fake documentation, the locksmith's truck idling in my driveway, and the pristine condition of my front door that she'd been demanding be destroyed. "This isn't a break-in," my mother snapped, her confidence returning as she waved the crumpled papers. "This is my daughter's house, and she owes the family. My son needs this place more than she does. She hasn't even talked to us in years." Officer Martinez glanced at his partner, Officer Kim, who was already pulling out her notepad. "Do you have legal documentation showing ownership transfer or power of attorney that's been notarized and filed with the county?" My mother's face flushed red. I have family rights. She's my daughter. After everything we did for her, raising her, feeding her." "Ma'am, that's not how property law works," Officer Kim interrupted gently but firmly. "Can you show us valid identification and explain your relationship to the property owner?" I remained perfectly still behind my window, watching this woman who had once controlled every aspect of my childhood now scrambling to explain to police officers why she thought she could simply take what belonged to me. The same woman who had told everyone at my high school graduation that I was getting too big for my britches when I announced my full scholarship to State University. Tony the locksmith approached the officers. "Look, I don't want any trouble. She called my company saying she needed to get into her son's house because the daughter had stolen it somehow. But when I checked the address, everything's registered to a Rebecca Chen. I told her I couldn't proceed without proper court orders." "Rebecca Chen," Officer Martinez repeated, checking something on his phone. "And you are?" "Linda Kowalski. I'm her mother. Rebecca owes this family everything. She thinks she's too good for us now, but..." "Ma'am, being someone's mother doesn't give you legal rights to their property," Officer Kim explained patiently. "Has Ms. Chen been notified that you're here?" My mother's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Notified? She won't even return my calls. She's been hiding from the family for 3 years, acting like she's some kind of big shot when we all know she was nothing before we raised her." Officer Martinez exchanged another look with his partner. "We're going to need to speak with the property owner to verify the situation. Is she currently available?" "How would I know?" my mother spat. "She could be anywhere, probably at some fancy job she thinks makes her better than everyone else." That's when Officer Kim's radio crackled to life. She listened to the brief message, then looked up with a slightly different expression. Actually, ma'am, we've been informed that Ms. Chen is currently on the premises and has been observing this situation. The color drained from my mother's face. She's here? Yes, ma'am. And she's the one who called us. The silence that followed was the sound of my mother's entire narrative crumbling. For 3 years, she'd been telling everyone that I was hiding, that I was ashamed, that I was avoiding the family because I knew I owed them. She'd constructed this entire story where I was the ungrateful daughter running from my responsibilities. But now, standing in front of my house, the house I'd bought with money I'd earned through work she'd never understood, she was realizing that I hadn't been hiding at all. I'd been building. And I'd been watching. She called you? My mother whispered, her voice suddenly small. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Chen reported an attempted break-in with fraudulent documentation. She's been monitoring the situation and requested police assistance when you attempted to have her door broken down. I could see my mother's mind racing, trying to process this new reality. The daughter she dismissed as too weak to handle real life had just demonstrated that she was powerful enough to mobilize the police with a single phone call. The girl she'd called helpless without family support was clearly doing just fine without any support at all. But she hasn't called us back. She won't talk to the family. She acts like we don't exist, my mother stammered, her fake documentation now hanging limply in her hand. Ma'am, that's her right, Officer Martinez said simply. Adults are not required to maintain contact with family members. However, attempted forced entry into someone's property is a crime, regardless of family relationships. My mother looked around desperately, at the police cars, at the neighbors who were now openly watching from their yards, at Tony who was climbing into his locksmith truck with obvious relief. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. In her mind, she was the wronged mother, and I was the selfish daughter who owed her everything. But standing there on my driveway, surrounded by officers who were treating her like what she was, someone attempting to break into a home that didn't belong to her, the truth was becoming undeniable. Her worthless daughter wasn't worthless at all. And in about 30 seconds, when I finally decided to step outside and face her directly, she was going to learn exactly how much power the girl she'd tried to erase had quietly accumulated. The triggering situation was complete. Now came the moment of truth. I stayed inside for exactly 3 more minutes, watching through my sheer curtains as the scene outside continued to unfold. This wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. Every second that passed was another moment for my mother to dig herself deeper into a hole she'd never be able to climb out of. Officer Martinez was now walking the perimeter of my property, documenting everything with his body camera. The pristine landscaping I'd paid for with my first major consulting bonus. The security system I'd installed after my second contract. The custom mailbox with R. Chen engraved in elegant script, not Kowalski, the name I'd legally changed when I turned 21. My mother followed him like a lost puppy, still clutching those ridiculous fake papers. Officer, you don't understand. This girl has always been difficult. Even as a child, she thought she was smarter than everyone else. She got some scholarship and decided she was too good for her own family. Ma'am, academic achievement isn't a crime, Officer Kim replied dryly, making notes on her pad. In fact, it's generally considered admirable. But she abandoned us. We needed help with Marcus, that's my son, Rebecca's brother, and she just disappeared. She got this fancy job and acted like we didn't exist anymore. Officer Martinez paused his inspection and turned to face my mother directly. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to ask you something important. When was the last time you actually spoke with your daughter? My mother shifted uncomfortably. Well, we tried calling her when Marcus got into some trouble. Financial trouble. She could have helped, but she ignored all our messages. How many messages? I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 over a few months. But she never called back, not once. And what kind of help were you requesting? My mother's face reddened again. Marcus owed some people money. Gambling debts. Nothing serious, just a few $1,000s. Rebecca could have easily covered it, but she's selfish. She always has been. Officer Kim stopped writing and looked up. You were asking your daughter to pay your son's gambling debts? It wasn't that much money. Not for someone with her salary. But she acted like we were asking for the world. She's probably making 6 figures now with that computer job of hers. The officers exchanged another look. I could see them beginning to understand the real dynamics at play here. This wasn't a concerned mother trying to reconnect with an estranged daughter. This was someone who viewed me as an ATM that had inconveniently developed the ability to say no. Ma'am, adults are not obligated to pay their siblings' debts, Officer Martinez said carefully. Even if they have the financial means to do so. But family should help family. That's what family means. And did your family help Rebecca when she was starting out? Officer Kim asked innocently. The question hung in the air like smoke. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Opened it again. She didn't need help. She was always independent. Too independent. She never asked for anything. Because she knew better than to ask you for anything, I whispered to myself behind the window. Officer Martinez continued his documentation, photographing the front door that my mother had tried to have destroyed, the windows I'd had professionally cleaned just last week, the small garden where I grew herbs for the cooking I'd taught myself on YouTube because no one had ever bothered to teach me. Has Miss Chen ever threatened you or your family? Officer Kim continued her questioning. Threatened? No, but... Has she ever contacted you to make demands or requests for money? No, she's never. Has she ever shown up at your residence uninvited? No, but that's exactly the problem. She acts like we don't exist. Like she's too good for her own family. Officer Kim finished writing and looked up. So, to clarify, your daughter has never threatened you, never asked you for money, never invaded your privacy, and never created any kind of disturbance in your life? My mother's silence was answer enough. And you're here today because Marcus needs help. And she owes us. After everything we did for her. What exactly did you do for her, Mrs. Kowalski? Another loaded silence. I knew my mother was scrambling, trying to think of examples that wouldn't reveal the truth, that she'd done the bare minimum legally required of a parent and resented every moment of it. We raised her. We fed her. We put a roof over her head. Those are basic parental obligations, ma'am. They don't create lifetime debt. The locksmith truck was long gone now, but neighbors were still watching from their doorways and windows. Mrs. Patterson from next door gave me a small wave through her kitchen window. She'd brought me homemade cookies when I first moved in, something my own mother had never done in 18 years of living in the same house. Officer Martinez walked back toward the group. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to be direct with you. What you've attempted today constitutes criminal trespass and potentially fraud, given these documents you've presented. He gestured to the crumpled papers she was still holding. These appear to be handwritten notes, not legal documents. They're legitimate family transfers. Ma'am, family transfers require proper legal documentation, notarization, and filing with the county. These are not legal documents. My mother looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would materialize to support her increasingly absurd claims. But she was alone on this. Just like I'd been alone when I was 18 and working 2 jobs to save money for college applications. Just like I'd been alone when I was 22 and sleeping on air mattresses in studio apartments. Just like I'd been alone when I was 25 and building my consulting business from nothing. The difference was, I'd learned to be comfortable with my own company. I'd learned to validate myself. I'd learned that the people who truly mattered were the ones who celebrated your success instead of trying to steal it. We're going to need to speak with Ms. Chen now, Officer Martinez announced. She's been very patient, but we need her statement to complete our report. I could see my mother's panic increasing. For 3 years, she'd been able to control the narrative about me. She could tell everyone I was hiding, that I was ashamed, that I was avoiding my responsibilities. But now she was about to face me directly, in front of witnesses, with no ability to spin the story in her favor. The calm before the storm was over. In 60 seconds, I would step outside, and my mother would have to confront the reality that the daughter she'd tried to diminish had become someone she couldn't ignore, couldn't manipulate, and definitely couldn't intimidate. I smoothed my blazer, navy blue, perfectly tailored, purchased with money I'd earned through work she'd never understood, and walked toward my front door. It was time to remind her exactly who she was dealing with. The front door opened with a soft click, and I stepped onto my wraparound porch, the one I'd designed myself and had built by contractors I'd personally vetted. I didn't rush. I didn't make grand gestures. I simply appeared in my own doorway, wearing the kind of confidence that money can't buy but years of proving yourself absolutely can. The effect was immediate and devastating. Officer Martinez straightened slightly, his professional demeanor shifting into something more respectful. Officer Kim looked up from her notepad with obvious relief, as if she'd been waiting for the reasonable adult to finally join the conversation. Even the neighbors who'd been pretending not to watch suddenly became openly curious, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. But my mother went completely still. Her mouth, which had been running non-stop for the past 15 minutes, snapped shut. The crumpled papers in her hand seemed to shrink as she took in my appearance, not the uncertain 18-year-old who'd left home with 2 suitcases and a dream, but a 30-year-old woman in a $500 blazer who clearly belonged in the house she was standing in front of. Ms. Chen. Officer Martinez approached me with a slight nod. I'm Officer Martinez. We understand you called about an attempted break-in? That's correct, I replied calmly, my voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of leading client meetings and presenting to city councils. This woman attempted to have my front door broken down using fraudulent documentation, claiming family rights to my property. My mother flinched at the word fraudulent, but she still hadn't spoken. She was staring at me like she was seeing a ghost, or maybe like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in her life. Can you confirm your relationship to Mrs. Kowalski? Officer Kim asked, pen poised over her notepad. Linda Kowalski is my biological mother, I said, the clinical phrasing deliberate. However, we have not had contact for over 3 years, and she has no legal claim to this property or any authority to make decisions on my behalf. Rebecca, my mother finally whispered, and I was struck by how small her voice sounded. For someone who'd spent my entire childhood filling rooms with her complaints and demands, she seemed suddenly uncertain of her right to even speak my name. I turned to look at her directly for the first time. Linda. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just her first name, delivered with the same neutral tone I'd used to address any stranger who'd tried to break into my home. Her face crumpled slightly at that. You look different. Of course I looked different. The last time she'd seen me, I was 27 years old, working 16-hour days to establish my consulting firm, wearing discount store clothing and driving a used Honda with a dent in the passenger door. Now I stood in front of the house I owned outright, wearing clothes that fit properly, with the kind of posture that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. Ms. Chen, Officer Martinez continued, can you tell us about the documentation Mrs. Kowalski presented to the locksmith? I glanced at the papers still clutched in my mother's hand. I've never seen those documents before, and I certainly never signed anything granting power of attorney or property rights to anyone in my family. Any such documentation would need to be properly notarized and filed with Pierce County, which these clearly are not. But I'm your mother. Linda burst out suddenly, her voice cracking with desperation. I raised you. I sacrificed for you. You can't just pretend we don't exist. I let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. You're absolutely right. You are my mother. And I have never pretended you don't exist. She looked confused, hope flickering in her eyes. I simply chose to exist separately from you. There's a difference. The hope died. Officer Kim cleared her throat. Mrs. Kowalski mentioned that you've been ignoring family requests for financial assistance. Can you tell us about that? Over the past 3 years, I've received approximately 47 phone calls and 63 text messages from various family members. I replied with the precision of someone who keeps detailed records. 98% of these communications were requests for money to cover Marcus's gambling debts, legal fees, or other financial emergencies. 0% were inquiries about my well-being, congratulations on my professional achievements, or simple social contact. My mother's face flushed red. "That's not, we tried to, you never answered." "I answered once," I said calmly. "In February of 2022. I offered to pay for Marcus to attend a gambling addiction treatment program. The offer was declined in favor of a request for direct cash payments to his creditors." Officer Martinez was taking notes now too. "And your response to that?" I explained that I don't enable destructive behavior, even in family members. Especially in family members. My mother was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The concept that someone might have boundaries, might make decisions based on principles rather than guilt, seemed completely alien to her. "But he's your brother," she pleaded. "Family helps family." "Family," I repeated thoughtfully, "is supposed to be mutual. It's supposed to involve support during difficult times, celebration during good times, and respect for each other's choices and boundaries." I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the scene, the police cars in my driveway, the neighbors watching from their windows, the crumpled fake documents in her hand. "Tell me, Linda, when was the last time anyone in our family celebrated one of my achievements? When did you congratulate me on buying this house? When did you ask about my business success? When did you show interest in my life beyond what I could provide financially?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. "That's what I thought," I said softly. Officer Kim looked between us with obvious understanding. "Ms. Chen, do you wish to press charges for attempted breaking and entering and fraud?" I considered the question carefully. My mother stood there, suddenly looking every one of her 58 years, surrounded by the consequences of her own choices. The daughter she dismissed as too ambitious for her own good was now powerful enough to have her arrested with a single word. But power, real power, isn't about destruction. It's about choice. "Not at this time," I said finally. "However, I want it clearly documented that Linda Kowalski has no authority over my property or my person, and any future attempts to circumvent legal procedures will result in full prosecution." Officer Martinez nodded. "We'll have that in our report. Mrs. Kowalski, you need to understand that what happened here today was serious. Any further attempts to access this property without permission will result in criminal charges." My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she kept wiping away with the back of her hand. "Rebecca, please. Marcus really needs help." And I thought maybe if I could just. "You thought you could take what I'd built and give it to someone else," I finished for her. "Just like you did when we were children. Just like you've always done." I stepped back toward my door, the conversation clearly over. "The help Marcus needs isn't financial, Linda. And it's not something you can steal from me." As I turned to go inside, I heard my mother's voice one more time, smaller and more broken than I'd ever heard it. "When did you become so cold?" I paused in my doorway and looked back at her one final time. "I didn't become cold, Linda. I became strong. There's a difference you never learn to recognize." Then I stepped inside and closed the door, leaving her to face the consequences of trying to take from someone who'd learned, finally, how to protect what was hers. Through my living room window, I watched the immediate aftermath unfold like a chess game where I'd just announced checkmate. The dynamic outside had shifted so completely that even the air seemed different, charged with the kind of tension that comes when everyone suddenly realizes they've been playing by the wrong rules. Officer Martinez was no longer treating this as a simple domestic dispute. His body language had changed from routine patrol officer to someone handling a situation that required delicacy and precision. He spoke into his radio with quiet authority, requesting additional documentation protocols and what sounded like a supervisor's input. Officer Kim had her phone out, clearly running checks on something, probably verifying my property ownership, maybe looking into my background. Within 30 seconds, her eyebrows raised slightly, and she showed her screen to her partner. Whatever they were seeing was confirming what I'd already demonstrated. This wasn't a family squabble between equals. But it was my mother's transformation that was most striking. The woman who'd arrived like a hurricane, screaming about breaking down doors and family rights, now stood frozen in place. Her fake documents hung limply at her side, forgotten. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. She kept looking between the officers and my front door, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become impossibly complex. "Mrs. Kowalski," Officer Martinez said, his tone now carrying a different weight, "I need you to understand the gravity of what occurred here today. Ms. Chen isn't just a private citizen, she's a prominent member of this community with significant professional standing." My mother blinked rapidly. "Professional standing? What do you mean?" Officer Kim consulted her phone again. "Ma'am, your daughter is Rebecca Chen of Chen Strategic Consulting. She's been the lead advisor on the last 4 major city development projects, including the waterfront renovation and the new municipal complex. She holds active contracts with Pierce County, the mayor's office, and 3 federal agencies." The color drained from my mother's face. "Federal agencies?" "Yes, ma'am. Ms. Chen is what we call a high-profile resident. Any incident involving her property gets flagged for special attention. That's why we responded with multiple units." I almost smiled at that. It wasn't entirely true. They'd responded quickly because I'd used my direct line to the police captain, a connection I'd developed through my work on community safety initiatives. But the officers were now seeing what I'd become while my family was busy dismissing me as a failure. I didn't know," my mother whispered, still staring at my house like it had transformed into something alien. "She never said, we thought she just had some computer job." "Some computer job," Officer Martinez repeated, consulting his own notes. "Ma'am, according to our records, Ms. Chen's consulting firm generated over $2.8 million in revenue last year. She's been featured in Business Weekly as one of the region's top 40 under 40. She sits on the boards of 3 nonprofit organizations and chairs the Municipal Planning Commission." Each fact hit my mother like a physical blow. I could see her trying to reconcile this information with the narrative she'd constructed about her disappointing daughter. The girl she'd called too smart for her own good had apparently become exactly as smart as she'd always been. It's just that now the world was paying attention. "But she left us," my mother said weakly. "She abandoned the family. She acts like she's too good for us." Officer Kim's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained professional. "Ma'am, from what we can see, Ms. Chen has built an impressive life for herself. That's not abandonment, that's success." The word success seemed to hit my mother particularly hard. She sank down onto my front steps uninvited, her head in her hands. "I don't understand. When did this happen? How did she become this?" Officer Martinez exchanged a look with his partner. "Mrs. Kowalski, perhaps the better question is, why didn't you know?" That question hung in the air like an accusation. Because the answer was obvious to everyone present except my mother herself. She hadn't known because she'd never bothered to find out. She'd been so busy writing me off as a disappointment that she'd completely missed my transformation from struggling young adult to established professional. "We tried to stay in touch," she said desperately. "But she wouldn't talk to us. She ignored our calls." According to Ms. Chen's statement, those calls were primarily requests for money to cover your son's gambling debts, Officer Kim pointed out gently. "That's not staying in touch, that's using someone as a financial resource." My mother looked up sharply. "That's not, we're family. Family helps each other. Help is mutual, ma'am. When was the last time you offered to help Rebecca with anything?" Another devastating silence. Through my window, I watched my mother's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "She never needed help," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "She was always so independent. So determined to do everything herself." Or maybe, Officer Martinez suggested carefully, she learned that she had to be independent because help wasn't available from her family. I could see that observation landing like a punch. My mother's hands were shaking now as she clutched those ridiculous fake documents, the physical evidence of her desperation and poor judgment. Officer Kim's radio crackled, and she stepped away to take the call. When she returned, her expression was even more serious. "Mrs. Kowalski, I've just been informed that we need to escalate this incident. Any attempted fraud or trespassing involving a municipal contractor requires additional documentation and potential involvement from other agencies." "Other agencies?" My mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. When someone of Ms. Chen's professional standing is targeted for property crimes, it becomes a matter of public interest. Her work involves sensitive municipal contracts and federal partnerships." I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. Because watching her realize that the daughter she'd tried to steal from was too important to steal from was like watching someone discover they'd been trying to rob a bank with a water gun. The scale of her mistake was becoming clear, and it was overwhelming her. I just wanted to help Marcus," she said, tears starting to flow again. "He's in so much trouble." And I thought since she wasn't using the family name anymore, since she acted like we didn't exist. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said firmly, "what your daughter achieved, she achieved on her own. Her success doesn't belong to your family, it belongs to her. The fact that she legally changed her name should have been your first clue that she'd moved on." The power shift was complete now. The woman who'd arrived thinking she could simply take what I'd built was now surrounded by evidence of exactly how much she'd underestimated me. The daughter she'd called a failure had become someone whose single phone call could mobilize not just police, but potentially federal oversight. She wasn't just facing the consequences of attempted theft anymore. She was facing the reality that the family disappointment had become the most successful person any of them had ever known. And I'd done it all without them. In spite of them. Which made their current desperation not my emergency, but simply the natural result of their own choices. The power shift was complete. Now came the reckoning. I moved away from the window and settled into my home office chair, the one I'd purchased after signing my first six-figure contract. From here, I could still observe the scene outside while remaining physically removed from it, a position that felt metaphorically perfect. For the first time in over 3 years, I was in the same space as my mother, yet completely insulated from her chaos by boundaries I'd built and power I'd earned. The officers were still talking to her, but I could see her attention kept drifting back to my house. She was taking in details she'd never bothered to notice before: the professional landscaping, the high-end security system, the subtle but expensive architectural modifications I'd made. This wasn't the life of someone scraping by or hiding in shame. This was the home of someone who'd not just survived without her family, but had thrived spectacularly. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "Everything okay over there? Saw the police cars. If you need anything, just holler." I smiled at that. Mrs. Patterson had brought me soup when I'd worked through a bout of flu last winter. She'd recommended her handyman when I needed my deck repaired. She'd celebrated with me when I'd gotten my biggest municipal contract, bringing over a bottle of champagne and asking genuine questions about my work. In 2 years, she'd shown me more familial care than my actual family had in 30. Another text came in, this one from my assistant. "Saw news alerts about police activity at your address. Do you need me to reschedule your 4 p.m. with the mayor's office?" Even that casual message illustrated the gap between my mother's perception and my reality. While she'd been constructing narratives about my supposed failure and isolation, I'd been building a professional network that included direct access to city leadership. The computer job she'd dismissed had evolved into consulting relationships that shaped municipal policy. Through my window, I watched Officer Kim showing my mother something on her phone screen. From my mother's expression, a mixture of shock and disbelief, I could guess what it was. Probably the Business Weekly article from last year, or maybe the Pierce County website where I was listed as a senior strategic advisor. Possibly even the photo from the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community center, where I stood next to the mayor as we celebrated a project I'd helped design. My mother's face was cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Confusion dominated, but underneath I could detect something that might have been pride struggling with something that was definitely regret. She kept looking at those images, then at my house, then back at the images, as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. The truth was, this moment had been inevitable from the second she'd decided I was a disappointment worth writing off. She'd missed every milestone because she'd never thought to look for them. My college graduation, magna cum laude, where I'd sat alone in the auditorium because I'd stopped expecting them to show up. My first apartment, small but entirely mine, paid for with income I'd earned independently. The night I'd signed the papers for this house, celebrating with takeout Chinese food and sparkling water because I had no family to call with the news. Each achievement had been a small death of the hope that they might notice, might care, might finally see me as something other than a problem to be managed or a resource to be tapped. But those small deaths had eventually become resurrections. Every time I'd succeeded without their validation, I'd become a little more immune to their opinions. Officer Martinez was now on his radio again, speaking in the measured tones that indicated he was consulting with supervisors about unusual circumstances. I caught fragments through my window: high-profile resident, municipal contractor, family dispute escalation. This was no longer being treated as a routine domestic incident. The presence of squad cars in my driveway had transformed into what the department would classify as a sensitive situation requiring careful documentation. My mother, meanwhile, was having what appeared to be an emotional breakdown. Not the dramatic, attention-seeking kind she'd specialized in during my childhood, but something quieter and more devastating. She kept whispering, I didn't know, as if repetition might somehow excuse 3 years of willful ignorance. But she had known, or could have known, if she'd ever bothered to look. My consulting firm's website listed our major projects. The local newspaper had run features on several municipal initiatives I'd led. City council meetings where I'd presented were public record, available online. The information about my success hadn't been hidden, she'd simply chosen not to see it because it didn't fit the narrative she preferred. I pulled up my laptop and scrolled through my calendar for the rest of the week. Tomorrow, a strategy session with the Planning Commission about sustainable housing initiatives. Thursday, a presentation to federal housing officials about a pilot program I designed. Friday, the monthly board meeting for the literacy nonprofit where I volunteered my time. Saturday, a community forum I was moderating about economic development. This was my real life, measured not in family drama or desperate phone calls about bailout money, but in meaningful work that improved people's lives. While my mother had been focused on Marcus's latest crisis, I'd been helping design programs that prevented other families from falling into similar cycles of dysfunction. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Captain Morrison, the police captain I'd worked with on community safety initiatives. I answered immediately. Rebecca, I heard about the situation at your residence. Everything all right? Yes, Captain. Thank you for asking. Just a family matter that got out of hand. My officers tell me someone attempted to gain fraudulent access to your property. My estranged mother tried to have my front door broken down using fake documents, claiming she was transferring the house to my brother. Nothing I couldn't handle with one phone call. A pause. Your family doesn't know about your professional standing? They've never been interested in my professional standing. Or much else about my life, for that matter. Well, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. For what it's worth, the officers say you handled it with complete professionalism. No drama, no escalation, just clear boundaries and proper procedure. I learned a long time ago that dignity is more powerful than drama. Indeed it is. Take care, Rebecca. As I ended the call, I realized that conversation perfectly encapsulated the transformation my mother was witnessing but couldn't yet comprehend. The police captain knew me as a professional partner, someone whose judgment he trusted and whose well-being mattered to the department. My mother knew me only as a daughter who'd disappointed her by refusing to bankroll her son's mistakes. Outside, Officer Kim was helping my mother to her feet. The fake documents had been confiscated as evidence, and she was being given what appeared to be a formal warning about trespassing and attempted fraud. Her Honda sat in my driveway like a rusty reminder of the gap between her expectations and my reality. The backstory was complete now. Everyone present understood exactly how we'd arrived at this moment. Years of dismissal and neglect had allowed me to build a life so successful that my family's attempt to steal from it had become a matter of municipal interest. Now came the part where my mother would have to decide whether she was capable of acknowledging what she'd lost, or whether she'd double down on the narrative that had brought her to this humiliating moment in the first place. Either way, the daughter she'd written off was no longer writing back. The ripple effect began almost immediately. I watched from my office window as Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house, ostensibly to water her flower boxes but obviously curious about the prolonged police presence. Behind her, old Mr. Hendricks from across the street had abandoned all pretense and was standing openly in his driveway, arms crossed, observing the scene with the intensity of someone watching a particularly compelling television drama. Within minutes, the quiet suburban tableau had transformed into something resembling a small-town spectacle. The mail carrier slowed his truck to a crawl as he passed, craning his neck to get a better look. Two joggers stopped at the corner, stretching elaborately while stealing glances. Even Mrs. Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, had stepped onto her porch with a coffee mug, her expression one of concerned neighborly interest. My mother seemed to realize she was becoming the center of unwanted attention. She kept looking around nervously, her face flushing deeper red each time she noticed another observer. This was clearly not how she'd envisioned this scenario unfolding. In her mind, she'd probably imagined a quick, private transaction, get the locksmith to open the door, establish her claim, present it to me as a fait accompli. Instead, she'd created a public spectacle that was documenting her humiliation in real time. Officer Martinez's radio crackled again, and this time his response was longer and more detailed. I caught enough fragments to understand that word was spreading through the department. Other officers were being briefed on the situation. Someone mentioned municipal contractor protection protocols. Another voice referenced high-profile incident documentation. My mother heard it too. High profile? She asked Officer Kim desperately. What does that mean? Why is this high profile? Officer Kim consulted her notes. Mrs. Kowalski, your daughter isn't just a private citizen. She's a public figure with significant responsibilities to the community. Any attempt to compromise her security or stability is treated as a potential threat to ongoing municipal operations. Municipal operations, my mother repeated weakly, as if the words were in a foreign language. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Chen is currently managing 3 federal grants totaling over $12 million. She's overseeing the Downtown Revitalization Project, the Affordable Housing Initiative, and the Community Safety Improvement Program. An attempt to illegally seize her property could be construed as an attempt to interfere with government contracts. I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. Because watching someone realize they've tried to steal from a person whose work affects thousands of lives is like watching someone discover they've been trying to rob Fort Knox with a crowbar. The scale of the miscalculation was becoming impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Sarah Chen, my deputy at the consulting firm, Rebecca, getting calls from reporters asking about an incident at your residence. Want me to prepare a statement? Reporters. Of course. In a city this size, police activity involving municipal contractors was considered newsworthy. Especially when it involved family disputes and attempted property theft. I typed back quickly, no statement necessary. Personal matter, handled professionally. Business as usual. But even as I sent that message, I knew the story would spread. Not maliciously, the local media respected my work too much for that, but factually. Municipal consultant's property targeted in family dispute. Rebecca Chen calls police on mother's break-in attempt. The headlines would be restrained but devastating for my mother's reputation in her own social circles. Through the window, I watched Officer Martinez approach his patrol car and return with what appeared to be additional paperwork. The incident was being documented with unusual thoroughness. Photos of the fake documents. Detailed statements from all parties. Background checks that would reveal the full scope of my professional standing. This wasn't just a police report anymore, it was becoming a case study in what happens when you target someone who's more connected than you realized. My mother was crying again, but differently now. Not the angry, frustrated tears of someone who felt wronged, but the hollow, defeated tears of someone who'd finally grasped the magnitude of their mistake. She kept looking at my house, really looking at it for the first time, and I could see her mental calculations happening in real time. The landscaping alone probably cost more than her annual income. The security system was clearly professional grade. The architectural modifications I'd made weren't cosmetic touches, they were substantial improvements that spoke to serious financial resources. This wasn't the home of someone who owed the family anything. This was the home of someone who'd built wealth independently and had no need for family approval or support. A new vehicle pulled up to the curb, an unmarked sedan with municipal plates. My stomach tightened slightly as I recognized Detective Ray Connors emerging from the driver's seat. Ray and I had worked together on several community safety initiatives, but his presence here meant the incident was being elevated beyond routine patrol response. Officer Martinez walked over to greet him, and I could see their conversation was serious. Ray kept glancing toward my house, then toward my mother, his expression growing more concerned. After a few minutes, he approached my mother directly. "Mrs. Kowalski? I'm Detective Connors. I understand you've had some interaction with Rebecca Chen today." My mother looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Are you going to arrest me?" "That depends on several factors, ma'am. Can you help me understand why you thought you had the authority to access Miss Chen's property?" And there it was, the question that cut straight to the heart of her delusion. Because the truth was, she'd never had that authority. Not legally, not morally, not in any way that made sense outside of her own twisted logic about family obligations and entitlement. "She's my daughter," my mother said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "Ma'am, being someone's parent doesn't grant you ownership rights to their adult property. Surely you understand that." My mother looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would materialize to explain why this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the growing crowd of neighbors, the multiple police vehicles, the detective asking pointed questions, all of it was confirming the same devastating truth. She'd miscalculated catastrophically. The daughter she'd dismissed as a failure had become someone whose single phone call could mobilize this level of official response. The family disappointment was actually the most successful person in the entire extended family tree. And her attempt to steal from me hadn't just failed, it had publicly exposed the depth of her own ignorance and desperation. Detective Connors was taking his own notes now, asking detailed questions about the fake documents, the locksmith's involvement, and the timeline of events. Each question was another reminder that this incident would have consequences far beyond this afternoon's embarrassment. My mother's panic was escalating as she realized that her attempt to solve Marcus's problems had potentially created much bigger problems for herself. Problems that couldn't be fixed with fake documents or family guilt trips. Problems that required lawyers and court appearances and official explanations. The ripple effect was in full motion now, spreading outward from my driveway into the broader community. And at the center of it all was my mother, finally confronting the reality that the daughter she'd tried to erase had become too important to ignore, too powerful to intimidate, and too well connected to steal from. The reckoning she'd avoided for 3 years was happening whether she was ready for it or not. I finally stood up from my desk chair, straightened my blazer, and walked to my front door. Not because the situation required my presence, the officers had everything well in hand, but because I'd decided it was time to demonstrate something important. Power exercised quietly is often more devastating than power exercised loudly. The moment I stepped onto my porch, the entire dynamic shifted again. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Even Detective Connors, who'd been questioning my mother with professional detachment, straightened slightly and nodded in my direction with unmistakable respect. "Miss Chen," he said, approaching with an extended hand. "Thank you for your patience while we sorted this out. I apologize that you had to deal with this disruption to your day." I shook his hand firmly. "Detective Connors, I appreciate the thorough response. This situation needed to be documented properly." My mother watched this exchange with growing horror. Here was a detective, a man with real authority, treating her daughter not as a victim of family dysfunction, but as a respected professional whose time was valuable and whose security mattered to the broader community. "Ma'am," Detective Connors addressed me formally, "given your role in several ongoing municipal projects, we want to ensure this incident doesn't represent any kind of escalating threat or harassment." "I don't anticipate any escalation," I replied calmly, my eyes meeting my mother's briefly. I believe all parties now understand the boundaries that need to be respected going forward. My mother flinched at the word boundaries. Because boundaries had always been her greatest enemy. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, she'd operated on the assumption that family relationships meant unlimited access to my time, my energy, my resources, my decisions. The concept that I might establish limits on that access had never truly registered until this moment. "Rebecca," she said suddenly, her voice cracking. Can we talk? Just for a minute? Please?" I considered the request. Around us, the small crowd of neighbors continued to watch. The officers maintained their professional distance. Detective Connors waited for my response with the patience of someone who understood that my comfort and consent were the priority here. "You have 5 minutes," I said finally. "But this conversation happens here, in front of witnesses, on the record." She nodded eagerly, then seemed to realize what I'd actually said. "In front of witnesses. On the record. No private manipulation. No emotional blackmail conducted in secret. Just truth, spoken clearly, with accountability." "I didn't know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About your job, about this house, about how successful you've become. I swear, Rebecca, I had no idea." "You didn't know because you never asked," I replied evenly. "In 3 years, you called me 47 times. Not once was the question, 'How are you doing?' or 'What's new in your life?' Every single call was a request for money to fix Marcus's latest crisis." Detective Connors was taking notes. Officer Kim had her recorder running. My words were becoming part of an official record that would follow this incident through any legal proceedings that might emerge. "But family should help family," my mother said, falling back on her familiar refrain. "Help is mutual," I said, echoing Officer Kim's earlier observation. "Tell me about the last time anyone in our family helped me with anything. Tell me about the last time someone celebrated my success or offered me support during a difficult period." Silence. "I'll save you the trouble of trying to remember," I continued. "It's never happened. The only time I hear from any of you is when you need something. That's not family, that's exploitation." My mother's face crumpled. "That's not true. We care about you." "No," I said firmly, "you care about what I can provide. There's a difference." Detective Connors looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Kowalski, I need to ask directly, have you or any family members made threats regarding Ms. Chen's property or assets in the past?" My mother shook her head quickly. "No threats. We thought since she wasn't using the family name anymore, since she acted like we didn't exist." "Ma'am, changing one's name is a legal right. It doesn't transfer property ownership to other family members." "But she owes us," my mother said desperately. "After everything we did for her, all the sacrifices we made." "What sacrifices?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Because we both knew the truth. She'd done the legal minimum required of a parent, provided basic food, shelter, and clothing, but had resented every moment of it. There had been no sacrifices, no extra efforts, no investments in my future beyond what was legally mandated. "We raised you," she said weakly. "You housed me until I was 18, I corrected." "There's a difference." Officer Martinez approached us. "Ms. Chen, we've completed our initial documentation. Do you need any additional security measures put in place?" "Security measures." My mother's eyes widened as she realized that her daughter wasn't just successful enough to afford a nice house, she was important enough to warrant police protection if needed. "I don't think that will be necessary," I said. "But I do want it noted that Linda Kowalski and any associates she might recruit have no authority to access this property or make claims about it." "Understood. We'll make sure that's clearly documented." My mother started crying harder. "Rebecca, please. Marcus is really in trouble this time. Real trouble. They're threatening him. He might have to go to jail. You could help. You have the money now. You have connections. Marcus is 42 years old, I said gently but firmly. His problems are the result of his choices. My success doesn't obligate me to enable his failures. But he's your brother. He's never acted like my brother. He's acted like my mother's favorite child who expected the family disappointment to subsidize his mistakes. Detective Connors cleared his throat. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to inform you that attempting to access someone's property through fraudulent means is a felony. The documents you presented to the locksmith constitute evidence of that crime. My mother went pale. Felony? Yes, ma'am. However, Miss Chen has indicated she doesn't wish to press charges at this time. But any future incidents will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. The power demonstration was complete. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't made threats, hadn't engaged in drama. I'd simply stood in my own driveway and let the truth speak for itself. The daughter they dismissed as a failure had become someone whose property was protected by law enforcement, whose time was valuable to municipal operations, and whose single phone call could mobilize resources they couldn't even imagine. Your 5 minutes are up, I said calmly. Officers, am I free to go back inside? Of course, Ms. Chen. We'll finish processing Mrs. Kowalski and clear the scene. I turned toward my door, then paused. Linda, I want you to understand something. This isn't punishment. This is simply what happens when you try to take from someone who's learned to protect what's theirs. I hope Marcus gets the help he actually needs. But that help won't come from me, and it certainly won't come from stealing my property. Then I walked back into my house, closing the door on a relationship that had been over for years but was only now being officially laid to rest. The quiet power had been demonstrated. Now came the aftermath. I didn't watch the final departure from my window. Instead, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, Ethiopian single origin, a small luxury I developed a taste for once I could afford it, and listened to the sounds of the scene winding down outside. Car doors closing. Engines starting. Radio chatter fading. The gradual return of suburban quiet to Willowbrook Drive. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of loaded quiet that comes after a controlled detonation, when the dust is still settling and everyone is assessing the damage. My phone had been buzzing steadily for the past 30 minutes with texts, calls, and notifications that I'd been deliberately ignoring. Finally, I picked it up and began scrolling through the messages. My assistant Sarah had fielded 3 media inquiries. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson wanted to know if I needed anything and mentioned she'd seen the whole thing. Detective Connors had sent a formal incident report number for my records. The mayor's office had left a voicemail asking me to call back when convenient. Clearly word was traveling through official channels. But it was the string of messages from unknown numbers that told the real story of how quickly news travels in families, even dysfunctional ones. Family members I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly reaching out, their messages carefully neutral but clearly fishing for information. Aunt Carol, hi Rebecca, heard there was some excitement at your house today. Hope everything's okay. Cousin David, Mom said something happened with Aunt Linda and the police. Just checking in. Uncle Frank, your mother called pretty upset. Says there was a misunderstanding. Want to make sure you're all right. Each message was a masterclass in family diplomacy, expressing concern without taking sides, seeking information without admitting they'd heard the embarrassing truth. They all knew Linda had done something spectacularly stupid, but they were hoping I might provide a version of events that would minimize the family shame. I deleted them all without responding. Instead, I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my security company. Today's incident had demonstrated that my privacy wasn't as protected as I'd assumed. If my mother could track down my address and show up with a locksmith, other people could find me too. It was time to upgrade my home security system, add cameras to the perimeter, and possibly consider a privacy fence. As I typed, I reflected on the irony. For years, my family had criticized me for being paranoid and antisocial when I'd been careful about sharing personal information. They'd mocked my trust issues and accused me of thinking I was too good for family gatherings. Now, their own behavior had proven that my caution had been justified all along. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus, my brother, calling for the first time in over 2 years. I stared at the screen for several rings, then answered. Rebecca. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the underlying panic. Marcus. Mom called me. She's pretty upset. Says the police were involved. Says you had her arrested or something. I didn't have her arrested. She attempted to break into my house using fraudulent documents. I called the police. They responded appropriately. A pause. Break into your house? That doesn't sound like Mom. Your mother showed up with a locksmith and fake power of attorney papers, claiming she was transferring my property to you because I'd abandoned the family. She was screaming about breaking down my door when the police arrived. Longer pause. Jesus, Rebecca. Why would she do that? You tell me, Marcus. This was supposedly for your benefit. What kind of trouble are you in that would make her think stealing my house was a reasonable solution? Another silence, and I could practically hear him calculating how much to admit. It's not. Look, I owe some people money. Significant money. Mom thought maybe you could help, but you never return calls, so she got desperate. How much money? $47,000. I nearly dropped the phone. $47,000? Marcus, what the hell did you do? Sports betting. It got out of hand. These aren't the kind of people you can just ignore, Rebecca. They've made threats. Real threats. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old family conditioning, the impulse to help, to fix, to rescue. $47,000 was serious money, but it wasn't impossible for me to manage. If Marcus was really in physical danger. Then I caught myself. Because this was exactly how the cycle perpetuated itself. Crisis, desperation, family guilt, rescue, temporary relief, then bigger crisis. I'd watched it play out with smaller amounts for years before I'd finally walked away. Marcus, I need you to understand something. Mom's attempt to steal my house today wasn't just illegal, it was a federal crime. I'm a government contractor. Attempting to fraudulently seize my property could be construed as interfering with federal contracts. She could face serious prison time. Prison time? Jesus, Rebecca, don't you think that's a little extreme? She's our mother. She tried to steal my house, Marcus. My actual house. Because you owe money to bookies. But you could help if you wanted to. You've got money now. You've got that big job, that fancy house. $47,000 is probably nothing to you. And there it was, the entitlement that had driven my mother to attempt theft. The assumption that my success existed to solve their problems. The belief that my hard work and careful choices created obligations to subsidize their poor decisions. Marcus, I need you to listen carefully. I didn't build this life to bankroll your gambling addiction. I worked 16-hour days for years to get where I am. I lived in studio apartments and ate ramen while building my business. Every dollar I have, I earned myself, without help from anyone in this family. But we're family. Family doesn't steal from each other, Marcus. Family doesn't show up at your house with locksmiths and fake documents. Family doesn't ignore you for 3 years and then suddenly demand money when convenient. Look, I know things have been complicated. But I'm really in trouble here. These people don't mess around. Then declare bankruptcy. Talk to a lawyer about debt consolidation. Get help for your gambling problem. But don't call me expecting a bailout, and definitely don't send Mom to steal my property. Rebecca, please. I'm begging you. Just this once. I swear I'll pay you back. With what money, Marcus? You're unemployed. You've been unemployed for 8 months. You have no assets, no income, and no plan except hoping other people will solve your problems. Silence. I'm hanging up now, I said calmly. And Marcus? If anyone in this family approaches my property again, or attempts to access my financial information, or tries any variation of what happened today, I will press full charges. Federal charges. Prison time charges. Are we clear? Rebecca, wait. I ended the call and immediately blocked his number. Outside, Willowbrook Drive had returned to its peaceful afternoon rhythm. Children playing in yards. Dogs being walked. Normal people living normal lives without the constant drama of family members who viewed success as theft and boundaries as betrayal. I finished my coffee and returned to my security company email. It was time to make sure that today's confrontation was the last one I'd ever have to endure. The family reckoning was complete. Now came the part where I chose peace over guilt, boundaries over obligation, and my own well-being over their endless crises. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely free. 3 days later, the pressure campaign began in earnest. It started subtly, a voicemail from Aunt Carol suggesting a family meeting to clear the air. Then Uncle Frank called, his tone carefully measured, proposing that perhaps everyone had overreacted and maybe we could all sit down like adults to work things out. By Thursday, the messages were coming in waves, each family member taking their turn at what they clearly believed was a coordinated intervention. I sat at my dining room table, working on a municipal housing proposal while my phone buzzed incessantly with calls I had no intention of answering. Each voicemail followed the same predictable script, expressions of concern for family unity, gentle suggestions that I was being too harsh, and carefully worded implications that my success came with obligations to help relatives in need. But it was Friday morning's email from my cousin Jennifer that finally crossed the line from annoying into genuinely manipulative. Jennifer, who I'd barely spoken to since high school, had somehow obtained my work email address and sent a 3-paragraph message that was masterful in its emotional manipulation. Rebecca, it began, I hope this message finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about family lately, especially after hearing about the unfortunate misunderstanding between you and Aunt Linda. I know you've worked incredibly hard to build your success, and we're all so proud of what you've accomplished. But I can't help but think about what your father would have said about family members not helping each other in times of crisis. He always believed that when one of us succeeded, we all succeeded. I know Marcus has made mistakes, but he's still our cousin, still family. Surely there's a way to help him without it costing you anything significant. After all, $47,000 is probably less than you spend on house payments in a year. I read the email twice, marveling at its calculated cruelty. Invoking my deceased father, who died when I was 12 and had never expressed any such philosophy about collective family success. Minimizing Marcus's gambling addiction as mistakes. Attempting to shame me by suggesting that my housing costs somehow created an obligation to pay his debts. And all of it sent to my professional email, crossing the boundary between personal family drama and my work life. I forwarded the email to my IT security team with a note about potential harassment concerns, then blocked Jennifer's email address across all my professional accounts. If the family wanted to escalate this into workplace interference, they would discover that I was far better protected professionally than they realized. My phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Pierce County Sheriff. I answered immediately. Ms. Chen. This is Deputy Williams. We've had several calls in the past few days from individuals claiming to be your family members, asking about the incident report from Tuesday. They're requesting copies of the police report and asking about the status of any charges. I see. And you're calling because the report involves a high-profile municipal contractor, there are specific protocols about information release. But also because the volume and nature of the call suggests possible coordinated harassment. We wanted to check with you directly. I leaned back in my chair, considering this development. The family wasn't just pressuring me directly, they were now contacting law enforcement, presumably trying to minimize the official record of Linda's attempted theft. It suggested a level of panic I hadn't anticipated. Deputy Williams, I appreciate you calling. Yes, this does feel like coordinated harassment. I've received approximately 23 calls and messages from various family members since Tuesday, all pressuring me to either help my brother financially or downplay the incident with my mother. 23 contacts in 3 days. That's definitely harassment territory. Would you like us to document this pattern? Yes, please. And I want to be clear, I have no intention of providing financial assistance to my brother or modifying my statement about Tuesday's incident. My mother attempted to commit a felony. That fact doesn't change because it's inconvenient for the family. Understood. We'll add this information to the case file. If the contact pattern escalates or becomes threatening, please let us know immediately. After ending the call, I realized that the family's pressure campaign was actually accomplishing the opposite of what they intended. Instead of wearing me down, they were providing documentation of their harassment behavior. Instead of making me feel guilty, they were demonstrating exactly why I'd been right to cut contact in the first place. My doorbell rang. Through the security camera I'd had installed Wednesday morning, I could see a woman I didn't recognize standing on my front porch with a manila envelope. Middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the security chain engaged. Can I help you? Ms. Chen. I'm Margaret Walsh, I'm an attorney representing Marcus Kowalski. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time to discuss a possible resolution to his current situation. My stomach dropped. They'd hired a lawyer. The family crisis had escalated to the point where they were bringing in legal representation to pressure me for money. The desperation was apparently even deeper than I'd realized. Ms. Walsh, I haven't agreed to any meeting. How did you get my address? Your brother provided it. I'm hoping we can discuss some mutually beneficial options that might help resolve his financial difficulties without requiring significant burden on your part. There are no mutually beneficial options, I said firmly. Marcus's gambling debts are his responsibility, not mine. And sending a lawyer to my home to pressure me for money is harassment. Ms. Chen, I understand this is a sensitive family situation. Perhaps if I could just explain some of the legal options available. Ms. Walsh, I'm going to stop you right there. I'm a municipal contractor with security clearances. Having a lawyer show up at my residence to pressure me for money on behalf of a family member with gambling debts is exactly the kind of situation that triggers federal background review protocols. Are you sure you want your name associated with this approach? Her confident expression faltered slightly. I wasn't aware of your professional status. Perhaps this approach was ill-advised. Perhaps it was. And Ms. Walsh? The next person who shows up at my home uninvited to discuss Marcus's financial problems will be reported to both local law enforcement and federal security officials. My work involves sensitive municipal contracts. Any attempt to compromise my security or stability is taken very seriously by multiple agencies. I closed the door and watched through the security camera as she hurried back to her car, clearly realizing she'd been hired for a job that was far more complicated than she'd been told. Within an hour, my phone was ringing again. Marcus, calling from a different number. Rebecca, please don't hang up. I need to explain about the lawyer. You sent a lawyer to my house, Marcus. To pressure me for money. That's not explaining, that's escalating. I'm desperate, okay? These people are serious. They've already vandalized my car. They're talking about more serious consequences. Then go to the police. File a report. Get protection. But don't send lawyers to my house as if I'm responsible for solving this problem. The police can't help with this kind of debt. You know that. But you could help. Easily. It wouldn't even dent your savings. And there it was again, the assumption that my financial stability existed to subsidize his poor choices. The belief that my success created an obligation to rescue him from consequences he'd created himself. Marcus, I'm going to explain this one final time. Your problems are not my problems. Your debts are not my debts. Your poor choices are not my responsibility. And if you or anyone else in this family continues to harass me, I will pursue legal action that will make Mom's attempted theft look like a minor inconvenience. Rebecca, please. I hung up and immediately called my attorney. It was time to make the harassment stop permanently, with legal consequences that even my family would understand. The pressure campaign was about to backfire spectacularly. My attorney, Patricia Hernandez, didn't waste time on pleasantries when she arrived at my office the following Monday morning. She'd reviewed the documentation I'd sent over the weekend, police reports, recorded voicemails, email screenshots, and a detailed timeline of the harassment campaign, and her expression was all business. "Rebecca, what your family is doing isn't just inappropriate, it's potentially criminal," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Coordinated harassment of a federal contractor, attempting to use legal intimidation, and sending representatives to your home to demand money. This crosses multiple legal lines." I figured as much. "What are my options?" Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Several. We can start with cease and desist letters to each family member who's contacted you. We can file for restraining orders if the contact continues. And given your professional status, we can invoke federal harassment protections that carry significant penalties." She paused, studying my expression. "But Rebecca, I need to ask, are you prepared for the nuclear option? Because once we start down this legal path, there's no going back to family dinners and holiday reconciliations. You'll be permanently severing these relationships through legal action." I looked out my office window at the city skyline, thinking about her question. The truth was, those relationships had been severed years ago. I'd just been too conditioned by family guilt to acknowledge it officially. What we were discussing wasn't destroying something healthy, it was simply formalizing the end of something that had been toxic from the beginning. "Patricia, let me ask you something. In your professional opinion, does any of this behavior suggest people who care about my well-being? Or does it suggest people who view me as a resource to be exploited?" "Honestly, everything I've seen suggests the latter. Classic financial abuse patterns, just happening in adulthood instead of childhood." "Then yes, I'm prepared for the nuclear option. I want this stopped permanently." Patricia nodded and began outlining the legal strategy. Cease and desist letters would go out immediately to all family members who'd participated in the harassment campaign. Any future contact would trigger restraining order applications. The lawyer Marcus had sent to my house would receive a formal complaint to the state bar for participating in what amounted to extortion attempts. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, looking up from her notes. "Given the pattern of behavior and the attempt to involve your professional life, I'd recommend we notify your federal security officer. This kind of family pressure campaign could be seen as a potential security vulnerability." My stomach clenched at that suggestion. Reporting family harassment to federal security would create an official record that could follow me throughout my career. But Patricia was right, if I didn't report it myself and it came to light later, it would look like I'd tried to hide a security issue. What would that involve? Full disclosure of the family situation, documentation of the harassment campaign, and ongoing monitoring to ensure you're not being compromised by family pressure. It's better to be proactive than to have this discovered during a background review. I made the call that afternoon. Agent Sarah Kim from the Federal Security Office listened without interruption as I explained the situation, from my mother's attempted theft to the coordinated pressure campaign that followed. Her questions were direct and professional, focusing on potential vulnerabilities and security implications. "Ms. Chen, have any family members attempted to gain access to your work materials or asked questions about your federal contracts?" "No, nothing like that. Their focus has been entirely on demanding money to pay my brother's gambling debts." "Any attempts to leverage your professional relationships? Threats to contact your colleagues or clients?" "My cousin sent a harassing email to my work address, but it was personal rather than professional in nature." "I see. And you've documented all contact attempts?" "Yes, everything is recorded or documented. I've also hired private counsel to pursue legal remedies." Agent Kim was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate your proactive disclosure. This kind of family financial pressure is exactly the type of situation we need to know about. We'll open a file to document the circumstances and provide guidance if the situation escalates." After ending the call, I sat in my office chair feeling strangely liberated. For the first time in my adult life, I had official, federal acknowledgement that my family's behavior was problematic enough to warrant security monitoring. The daughter they dismissed as too sensitive and too dramatic now had government agents documenting their harassment. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Rebecca, this is Jennifer. I heard you're considering legal action against the family. That seems extreme. Can we talk before you do something you'll regret? I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Patricia with a note, 24th contact since Tuesday's incident. Please add to harassment documentation. Then I blocked the number and returned to my work. An hour later, Patricia called with an update. Rebecca, I've sent the cease and desist letters via certified mail. They should be delivered by tomorrow. I've also filed a formal complaint against the lawyer who showed up at your house. The state bar takes dim view of attorneys who participate in family extortion schemes. What about the federal security notification? Agent Kim called me directly. She wanted to confirm some details about the timeline. She seemed impressed with how thoroughly you've documented everything. She also mentioned that proactive disclosure like this actually strengthens your security clearance rather than threatening it. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at the upscale restaurant downtown where I'd celebrated signing my first major municipal contract 3 years ago. As I sat alone at a table by the window, watching the city lights reflect off the harbor, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. 3 years ago, I'd been celebrating my first real success while secretly hoping my family might finally acknowledge my achievements. Tonight, I was celebrating the legal elimination of their ability to interfere with my life. The transformation was complete. I'd gone from seeking their approval to actively preventing their involvement. My phone remained blissfully quiet throughout dinner. No calls, no texts, no voicemails demanding explanations or pleading for reconsiderations. For the first time in years, I was experiencing what it felt like to live without the constant background noise of family dysfunction. As I walked back to my car, I realized something profound had shifted. The weight I'd been carrying, the guilt, the obligation, the fear of disappointing people who'd never been proud of me anyway, was simply gone. Not because I'd learned to ignore it, but because I'd finally recognized it as illegitimate in the first place. Tomorrow, the cease and desist letters would arrive. The family would learn that their pressure campaign hadn't just failed, it had triggered legal consequences that would follow them if they ever tried anything similar again. The broader impact recognition was becoming clear. My quiet refusal to be victimized was creating ripples that extended far beyond my own life. Other people in similar situations would see that boundaries could be enforced, that family dysfunction didn't have to be endured, and that success didn't create obligations to subsidize other people's failures. But tonight, I simply enjoyed the profound peace that comes from finally choosing yourself over people who never chose you. 6 months later, I stood in the community center auditorium, looking out at an audience of 200 people who'd come to hear me speak about building success despite family dysfunction. The invitation had come from the local women's professional network, but word had spread beyond their membership. The room was filled with faces I recognized, colleagues, clients, neighbors, and many I didn't, all drawn by a story that had apparently resonated far beyond my original intention. The cease and desist letters had worked exactly as Patricia predicted. The harassment stopped immediately after their delivery. No more phone calls, no more surprise visits, no more lawyers at my door. The silence that followed wasn't the hostile quiet of unresolved conflict, but the peaceful absence of people who'd finally understood that their behavior had consequences they couldn't afford. Marcus had declared bankruptcy 3 weeks after the legal notices arrived. According to Aunt Carol, who'd violated the cease and desist order exactly once before apparently thinking better of it, he'd entered a gambling addiction treatment program and was working at a warehouse job, slowly rebuilding his life without expecting family bailouts. Whether that would last remained to be seen, but it was no longer my concern. My mother had moved in with her sister in another state. I'd heard this through Mrs. Patterson, who'd heard it through the neighborhood grapevine. Linda had apparently told people she needed a fresh start, somewhere she could heal from family trauma. The irony of her positioning herself as the victim wasn't lost on me, but it also wasn't my problem to correct. When people asked me about the day my mother tried to steal my house, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. They usually expect a story about revenge or dramatic confrontation. But the real story is about something much quieter and more powerful, the moment I finally chose my own peace over their chaos. I'd been invited to speak because my story had become something of a legend in local professional circles. Not the details of the attempted theft, those had remained mostly private, but the broader narrative of someone who'd built success despite family dysfunction and then protected that success through clear boundaries and legal action when necessary. For years, I carried guilt about my family's problems, I continued. I'd been conditioned to believe that my success created obligations to solve other people's failures. That because I'd managed to build a stable life, I somehow owed that stability to relatives who'd never supported my efforts to achieve it. In the audience, I spotted several faces that looked familiar from my own journey. Young women in their 20s and 30s, some wearing the determined expression of people still fighting for recognition in their own families. Others with the exhausted look of people who'd been funding other people's crises for too long. But here's what I learned: success doesn't create debt to people who never invested in your success. Achievement doesn't obligate you to subsidize other people's poor choices. And family relationships that exist only when you're providing something aren't actually family relationships at all. A woman in the third row was nodding emphatically, her notebook open, taking detailed notes. Beside her, an older woman, maybe 50, was crying quietly, the kind of tears that come from recognizing your own story in someone else's words. The day my mother showed up with a locksmith, demanding access to my property, she wasn't just trying to steal my house. She was trying to steal my autonomy, my boundaries, and my right to make decisions about my own life. The legal response wasn't about punishment, it was about protection. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for dysfunctional people is to stop enabling their dysfunction. I paused, letting that concept settle. Because that had been the hardest lesson for me to learn, that refusing to rescue people from their own choices wasn't cruelty, it was actually a form of respect for their agency as adults. Today, I live in that same house, but it's truly mine now in ways it never was before. Not just legally, but emotionally. I don't wake up wondering when the next crisis call will come. I don't budget for family emergencies that aren't really emergencies. I don't carry the weight of other people's choices on my shoulders. The applause started before I'd finished the sentence, building as people recognized the freedom I was describing. In the back of the room, I could see Patricia Hernandez, who'd become not just my attorney but something of a friend. She was smiling with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched a client transform from victim to empowered adult. But the most important thing I want you to understand is this: choosing yourself over dysfunction doesn't make you selfish. It makes you healthy. And healthy people can contribute more to the world than people who are constantly drained by other people's crises. After the formal presentation, the question and answer session lasted almost an hour. People wanted to know about the legal process, about dealing with guilt, about maintaining boundaries with persistent family members. Each question revealed another person struggling with similar dynamics, another story of success being undermined by family dysfunction. A young woman named Sarah approached me afterward, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "Ms. Chen, my story is so similar to yours it's scary. My brother has addiction issues, and my parents keep calling me for money. I've been thinking about cutting contact, but I feel so guilty." Guilt, I told her gently, is often just conditioning. Ask yourself this: do you feel guilty about not giving money to strangers who make poor choices? No? Then why should family members who make poor choices be different? She nodded, writing my words in her notebook like they were a prescription for healing. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how far I'd traveled from the woman who'd sat in her office 6 months ago, watching police cars arrive in her driveway. That woman had been successful but still trapped by family obligations that existed only in her own mind. Tonight's woman was free, not just from harassment, but from the entire framework that had made the harassment possible. My house came into view as I turned onto Willowbrook Drive, its windows glowing warmly in the winter dusk. The security fence I'd installed wasn't just physical protection, it was a symbol of boundaries that extended far beyond property lines. This wasn't just where I lived anymore. It was the place I'd chosen myself over people who'd never chosen me. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my reading chair with a book I'd been looking forward to all week. No phone calls interrupted my evening. No crisis demands divided my attention. No guilt clouded my contentment. For the first time in my life, I was completely free to be exactly who I'd always been, a woman who'd built something beautiful from nothing, who'd learned to protect what was hers, and who'd discovered that the most powerful thing you can say to people who try to diminish you is simply, quietly, and irrevocably, no. The story was complete. Not because the conflicts had been resolved, but because I'd finally learned that some conflicts don't need resolution, they need ending. And sometimes the most empowering thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to value what you've built and create a life so fulfilling that their absence feels like a gift rather than a loss. I was no longer the daughter who'd failed to meet their expectations. I was the woman who'd exceeded my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.